In the early 1960s, Marvel Comics began pumping out superheroes by the boatload, like the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, and the Amazing Spider-Man. However, when the time came to create yet another superhero, Stan Lee found himself in a bit of a pickle. You had a character like the Hulk, who was the, quote, strongest man there ever was, and yet, could you actually do something that was stronger? And then he hit on the idea of, well, instead of just making it another super strong man, why not just go all the way and make the next hero a god?
Feeling that the Greek and Roman pantheon had already been fairly well tapped by popular culture, Lee decided to try using the Norse Aesir for material, hitting upon the idea of using the most popular Norse god, Thor. For art, naturally, Jack Kirby would be called upon to draw the Norse god of thunder, having already portrayed him for DC in the 1950s. With that, Thor would come to Marvel Comics.
Now then, this wasn't exactly a direct translation of Norse mythology, which usually depicts Thor as a bearded redhead rather than a beardless blonde. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure most of the members of the Aesir did not speak in Middle English.
Still, the mighty Thor would endure throughout the decades, becoming not only a founding member of the Avengers, but also one of the most popular heroes in the Marvel Age. The character debuted in the anthology comic Journey into Mystery due to Marvel being in a distribution agreement that limited to 8 books a month.
Today we are looking at the first 17 adventures of Marvel's God of Thunder and Rock and Roll. This is the Marvel Masterworks, The Mighty Thor, Volume 1.
Dr. Donald Blake is on vacation in Norway when he overhears a local fisherman tell of giant stone aliens arriving as part of an invasion fleet on a local beach. While the other locals laugh the fisherman off, Blake is intrigued and goes to investigate. He spots the creatures, but inadvertently alerts them to his presence, and as he tries to get away, he winds up breaking the cane that he needs to walk. Blake ducks into a cave in order to hide. Unfortunately, the second exit is blocked by a giant boulder that would be impossible to move, even if the good doctor didn't just have a congenital limp. It's then that Blake happens across a gnarled stick on the ground and attempts to use it as a crowbar to try to pry the boulder. When that proves futile, Blake angrily strikes the stick on the ground and suddenly finds himself enveloped in light and transformed into a giant muscular beef chunk of a man. It's then that Blake notices that the stick has been transformed into a giant hammer with an inscription on it reading that the person who wields it, if they be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. Thor manages to move the boulder with relative ease and exits the cave. Afterwards, he sits down to plot his next maneuver, where suddenly he finds himself reverting back to being Donald Blake. It turns out that being separated from the hammer, Mjolnir, for more than 60 seconds causes him to revert back to being human. He can return back to being Thor by tapping it on the ground like he did earlier. Now fully aware of his new abilities, Thor uses the hammer as a propeller to take off and take down the alien menace.
First things first, yes, these aliens are in fact the same race as the character Korg, who you might know from Planet Hulk, or more likely Thor Ragnarok. Second is the fact that the exact circumstances of how Donald Blake and Thor are connected are still kind of murky at this point, with it seeming that Blake is still in charge, with Thor sharing the same speech patterns and mannerisms as Donald Blake.
Dr. Blake returns to his medical practice in New York City and is Nurse Jane Foster. Even though it's the 1960s and there aren't exactly any rules prohibiting that sort of thing, Blake's physical handicap has prevented him from pursuing any type of sexual harassment, romantic relationship with Jane. Still, Dr. Blake is brave enough to volunteer for a Red Cross relief mission to the war-torn country of San Diablo. However, the communist forces in San Diablo attack the Red Cross vessel, meaning that Blake must pull out Thor to stop the threat and then make it look like he fell overboard by accident. That being said, the next time the commies attack, Blake needs to be more subtle and simply whips up a microburst. However, that turns out to be rather ineffective as Blake and Jane Foster wind up getting taken hostage and brought before the communist leader who calls himself the Executioner. The Executioner steals Blake's walking stick and threatens to execute him unless Jane agrees to marry the tyrant. Blake refuses to go quietly but manages to grab his stick before the firing squad can arrive so he can duck behind a wall and transform into Thor. Thor manages to take down the communist forces with relative ease, and the Executioner winds up getting killed by his own men while trying to flee with their money, meaning that communism is dead. For now. As Dr. Blake and Jane Foster return to the United States, Jane admits she's smitten with this new Thor guy.
Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of that in this book.
Across the rainbow bridge of Asgard, where the booming heavens roar, you'll behold in breathless wonder.
Loki entombed in a tree.
Yes, the trickster god was condemned by his fellow Asgardians to spend eternity trapped in a tree, lest another god shed tears for him. Of course, that does leave a bit of a loophole. For example, if a leaf should happen to, fall off said tree and hit Heimdall in the eye, that would cause some tears, and, now Loki is free. Loki arrives on Earth and manages to track down Thor, who's making a personal appearance at a local children's hospital. Naturally, the trickster plans a prank to lure his adopted brother out into the open by turning people photonegative. It works, and then Loki further lures Thor into being hypnotized and tossing Mjolnir into a pond in Central Park. When the enchanted hammer manages to return to its original owner, Loki instead decides to create a Thor doppelganger to hold the hammer for a temporary amount of time. Loki then leaves to wreak havoc across New York City. However, when the 60 seconds are up, Thor reverts back to Donald Blake, and that breaks the spell. Blake picks up the hammer, changing back into Thor, and then tosses Loki across New York City and all the way back to Asgard.
Don't worry, there's still way more Loki to come.
In the year 2260, utopia has been achieved, which of course means someone's angry. In this case, it's a scientist named Zarko who has constructed a time machine to conquer the past with his futuristic technology of the present. Unfortunately for Zarko, he's beaten to the punch when some guy claiming to be a monk travels back to the year 1066. With that in mind, the scientist decides to alter his plan by traveling back to the past so he can steal an atomic bomb and bring it to his present. It just so happens that Zarko arrives at a weapons test that Thor is attending, for some reason, and the scientist must avoid Mjolnir before getting back into his time machine. Thor is forced to enlist the aid of his father Odin, king of the Aesir, to travel forward to Zarko's time. Upon arrival in the year 2260, Thor finds out that Zarko is holding all of society hostage with the bomb.
You know, when Zarko grabbed that bomb, the timer had already been activated and was counting down, so I hope he managed to find a way to stop that, or else this plan is going to look really stupid really fast.
Thor proceeds to make his way through Zarko's guards and several booby traps to confront the mad bomber who may bomb at midnight. Just as it appears that Zarko has the drop on him by trapping Thor in a hall of mirrors, the Thunder God reveals it all to be a switcheroo with a body double. Thor then snaps a drainage pipe in half to level an army of robots and blasts Zarko with lightning to claim the somehow still unexploded bomb. Thor then returns to the present day of the 1960s where the USA can more properly blow things up. Alas, it appears there's no rest, as several of America's top scientists suddenly disappear, leaving behind notes claiming they're defecting to the Reds. The FBI is bewildered as to why so many scientists have become fans of Cincinnati's baseball team, only for someone to then point out they probably meant the Soviets. Apparently forgetting that he's a surgeon and not a scientist, Donald Blake volunteers to use himself as bait, passing himself off as a bioweapon specialist to see what's going on. It works, and Blake's suspicions are soon confirmed, as it turns out he's not suddenly teammates with Frank Robinson and Pete Rose, but rather he's being held in a dungeon in Moscow with the other missing scientists. Blake transforms into Thor and sets about trying to rescue the hostages. However, when the Russian leader threatens to pull the self-destruct lever and kill everyone, Thor has no choice but to yield and submit to be studied. However, a funny thing happens as Thor is strapped down to a table. He gets separated from Mjolnir long enough to revert to being Donald Blake, thus making him able to slip 3 of his now Thor-sized bonds. He reconnects with the hammer and sets about freeing the other scientists and destroying the facility. The group must then go deep undercover to get out from behind the Iron Curtain and back to the United States.
And now what I'm sure you've all been waiting for, because, yeah, we've really needed it. More Loki!
Loki is forever imprisoned in Asgard and banished to its dark forest. However, that doesn't mean the trickster won't yield so easily, and he performs a ritual that allows him to spy on Thor's adventure in Russia. Loki even manages to bear witness to Thor turning into Donald Blake. Realizing that this could be the key to victory over his adopted brother, Loki transforms into a snake to slip by Heimdall and take the Bifrost back to Earth. Loki takes the guise of an old man and hypnotizes Jane Foster to allow him to see Donald Blake. Once the masks are quite literally taken off, the two make arrangements for one final battle that afternoon in Central Park. Loki then uses the hypnotized Jane as a human shield, even going as far as to conjure up a tiger to attack her after Thor has just launched Mjolnir from his hand. Knowing the only way he could save Jane is to abandon Mjolnir, Thor does so, allowing it to become trapped in the force field. Knowing that his adversary is now trapped as Donald Blake, Loki transforms into a bird and flies away to wreak havoc around the world. Dr. Blake manages to revive Jane and heads back to his practice where he hits on an idea. He pulls another switcheroo, this time using a plastic Thor mannequin, which in turn makes Loki believe he has to go back and check on the hammer by removing the force field. Lying in wait, Dr. Blake jumps out and reclaims the hammer, allowing him to turn back into Thor and take Loki back to Asgard permanently, until the next time he breaks free. Afterwards, Donald Blake returns to his medical practice and dealing with his conflicted feelings for Jane Foster, who in turn is dreaming of giving Thor a makeover. Meanwhile, across town, mob boss Thug Hatcher is being transported to the local jail. It's not a smooth transfer, as his lackeys attempt to break him free, and in the ensuing shootout, Thatcher is shot, and his lackeys rush into Donald Blake's office to try to find help. Jane is tied up, while Blake is taken to a farmhouse on the outskirts of town. There, he performs surgery on Thatcher, as the mobster's lackeys and his comare Ruby look on. Thatcher pulls through and orders Blake to be taken out, much to Ruby's dismay.
Wow, a mobster who turned out to be a real jerk. I'm so shocked.
Thankfully, Blake is able to relay a telepathic message to Odin, who hits the farmhouse with a blast, providing enough of a distraction for Blake to return to Thor. The mobsters attempt to flee, but Thor traps them in some falling trees, all except for Thatcher and Ruby, who slip away and head back to Dr. Blake's office, where they intend to use the still bound and gagged Jane Foster as leverage. It doesn't work, though, as Thor is able to safely propel Jane through a window via a whirlwind. Thatcher abandons Ruby, only to wind up getting shot by the police.
Happy ending?
Recent events have pushed Donald Blake into deciding to reveal his true feelings to Jane, as well as his identity as Thor. However, a message from Odin expressly forbids such an idea for reasons. It's then that all of New York City becomes increasingly rude. Even Jane Foster says they need to start charging big bucks to their patients.
New Yorkers being assholes. Perish the thought.
Baffled, Thor goes out to investigate and happens across a spaceship from the planet Zartan. The Zartans are using their technology to shapeshift into human beings and bring down society. They've even managed to copy both Jane Foster and the mayor of New York City. A magnet beam from the ship separates Thor from Mjolnir, causing him to revert to Donald Blake. When he's taken hostage and the Zartans ask for directions on how to deal with Thor once and for all, Blake gives in and agrees to their demands, much to the shock and dismay of Jane and the mayor of New York City. Of course, this is all a ruse to send the Zartans on a snipe hunt, while Blake can reunite with Mjolnir and transform back into Thor. Thor frees Jane and the mayor, explaining that this was part of his plan with Donald Blake the whole time. The Zartans return and attempt to attack Thor, but all attacks prove fruitless and they wind up getting banished to their homeworld, never to be seen again.
Seriously, I don't think the Zartans have ever come back. That doesn't count.
Thor is out on patrol when he notices a nearby bank floating in the air before vanishing. He immediately suspects the work of Loki, but no, the trickster is still tied up in Asgard. So of course it's actually Loki. In this case, he's manipulating a carnival mind reader called Sandu by expanding his mental prowess. The psychic naturally then begins using his newfound abilities to steal people's money. Other than the ordinary way that he was already using his newfound abilities to steal people's money. Soon, Sandu upgrades to stealing whole buildings like the bank from earlier and placing them on the moon. It goes too far when Sandu steals the Taj Mahal, which leads to a military confrontation. Then Thor finally gets involved, only for Sandu to psychically trap him under a building trapped in the foundation. Odin pieces together what's going on and decides to get involved by giving Thor a belt to augment his strength. Loki commands Sandu to destroy Mjolnir, but instead Sandu tries to pick the hammer up and a feedback loop happens that drains him of all his powers, leaving Loki to try again later. Then again, there could be more pressing concerns as Donald Blake's office is invaded once more by a group of criminals who are involved in a shootout. Blake uses some vocal projection to distract the bad guys and turn into Thor, the rest writes itself. From there, Thor returns to Norway to provide his visual effects for Roger Corman's Viking Women vs. the Sea Serpent.
Call me Ishmael.
It's here that Loki finally begins initiating his new plan, as it turns out he's chained to a tree with Uru metal, the same material that Mjolnir is made of. He uses his magic to magnetize the chains, which draws the hammer and breaking them instantly, allowing the trickster to finally be free again. Loki then uses Mjolnir as bait to lure Thor back to Asgard so the two can supposedly battle on even ground. Loki attempts to attack Thor with some enchanted trees, only for Thor to fashion a temporary wooden hammer. Next up, it's dragons, only for Thor to locate a rock made of Uru metal to fashion new Mjolnirs from. It's then that Thor is able to locate the original Mjolnir and take Loki down. From there, Thor moves on to India to help them fend off an invasion by Chinese forces. Thor's domination of the Imperial Army greatly upsets Chairman Mao, who begins ordering his top officials to begin doing something to take out the Thunder God. One such official named Chen Lu has already started a plan by exposing himself to low amounts of radiation. Finally, he gives himself a massive dose which saturates his skin, making him a radiation man.
That's radioactive man, jerk!
Pleased with the results, Chairman Mao dispatches the radioactive man to New York City via torpedo to take on Thor. Chen begins wreaking havoc across the city, issuing an open challenge to Thor. The problem is that Donald Blake is trapped in surgery at the moment. Eventually, Thor does square off with the radioactive man, who is fully capable of deflecting many of the Thunder God's attacks. He then uses his radiation to hypnotize Thor, getting him to throw away Mjolnir in the process.
Man, I hope no one in Manhattan was planning on having children anytime soon.
Thor reverts to being Donald Blake, which of course breaks the brainwashing, and he manages to slip back to his office so he can track Mjolnir's energy signature to the East River.
Which in all likelihood makes the hammer more radioactive than the Chinese guy.
Blake then reclaims the hammer and sends Radioactive Man back to China via whirlwind.
The Radioactive Man does become a longtime Marvel nemesis, often taking on the Avengers, though he does very briefly actually turn hero when he becomes a member of the Thunderbolts.
When an experimental missile flies off course, Thor is called in to deal with it. Somehow, the cosmic explosion winds up freeing Loki, who manages to conjure up a dragon, which distracts Thor long enough for the returning Mjolnir to catch him in the back of the head, giving him amnesia. From there, Loki is able to manipulate his adopted brother telepathically to come back to Asgard and properly free him so the two can then take over Earth. Once back on Earth, the two set about causing destruction all across the globe, causing earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, and even stealing landmarks, except for Mount Rushmore, as 3 other cosmic people freed by a nuclear explosion in space already took care of that. Finally, Thor and Loki hit the United Nations and demand control of Earth. However, while storming the stage, Thor accidentally triggers a trap door and loses Mjolnir as he falls down. The hammer then drops on Thor's head, returning his memory and getting him to take Loki back to Asgard to ask for forgiveness from his fellow Norse Aesir.
I guess by asking the Norse gods, that also just includes everyone else on Earth as well.
After briefly returning to Asgard to help with a drought, Thor visits a symposium hosted by Professor Saxton, designing a new android that Donald Blake designed the anatomical schematics for. The android can perform complicated math equations and is strong enough to resist even an attack from Mjolnir. Unfortunately, Saxton makes a bit of an oopsie-doodle and presses all the control buttons at once, causing the operating system to overload and perform an illegal operation, meaning that everything is soon going to explode. Thor manages to remedy the situation by throwing the mechanoid out the window, where it winds up blowing up and destroying hopefully empty office buildings. He then returns to Dr. Blake's office to find none other than Dr. Saxton waiting there. He's taken Jane Foster hostage in order to demonstrate his real invention, a duplication machine. He aims it at a chair and boink! Now there's 2.
Look, if Calvin and Hobbes has taught us anything, it's that human duplication machines go boink.
Saxton wants Blake's help so that he can duplicate living beings and then use the duplicator to also perform mind control on them. In order to force Blake into doing so, he's using Jane Foster as leverage. With no other choice, Blake works, and soon Saxton is able to make multiple cats. Blake is so upset by his actions that he willingly transforms to Thor in front of Saxton, who blasts the Thunder God with the duplicator, and boink, there are now 2 Thors. Not only that, but this duplicate can now wield multiple Mjolnirs. The 2 Thors brawl outside, where the real Thor manages to get a bit of an upper hand by striking his doppelganger with multiple lightning bolts. Of course, Saxton is still able to just make multiple duplicate Mjolnirs. However, the real Thor realizes that he can also wield the duplicate Mjolnirs, and he's also made his doppelganger unworthy of doing so. Thor takes care of his evil clone and begins turning his attention to Saxton, who attempts to just duplicate himself. Unfortunately, in the process of using the duplicator, Saxton trips and falls over the edge of the roof to his death. Thor then wipes the recent events from the mind of the duplicate, so maybe the professor can actually wind up doing some good again in the world.
I didn't actually point this out earlier, but Thor also mind-wiped Ruby, the mobster's girlfriend, of the traumatic incidents that she had just been through.
Soon there's a newsflash of the tomb of the Arthurian wizard Merlin being discovered, and it begins to put Thor on edge. Meanwhile, Dr. Blake is also on edge with Jane, as his unknown actions as Thor are beginning to cost him patience. Of course, it doesn't help that his head nurse is still fawning over the Thunder God. As this happens, Merlin's tomb is open, revealing a perfectly preserved wizard. Not only that, but he soon comes back to life and prepares to try taking over the world. Why exactly? Because Merlin used to be a good guy until the Kingdom of Camelot accused him of witchcraft, and now he doesn't trust anyone and he's on his own. Merlin sets about trying to sabotage an intercontinental ballistic missile, but Thor manages to stop it and immediately then goes off to check on Loki.
I mean, why wouldn't he at this point?
Loki confirms Merlin to be behind the predicament, and Thor takes off to fight the wizard. It turns out that Merlin has taken the White House and President Kennedy hostage. The two duke it out in the nation's capital, with Merlin even going as far as to literally throw the Washington Monument at Thor. Finally, Thor reverts to Donald Blake to convince Merlin that there are other gods who are way more powerful than him that could easily just mop the floor with the wizard. Merlin is forced to then return to his tomb to spend the rest of his time in stasis.
Okay, so at this point there's a series of backup stories called Tales of Asgard, but really all they're doing is retelling old myths from the Norse Aesir, so we're just going to skip over them, okay?
After stopping a plane crash, Thor returns to the offices of Donald Blake. It's then that Jane gives the doctor an ultimatum. Give her a reason to stay, i.e. admit his true feelings to her, or she'll take a job with a doctor who's more willing to hit on his nursing staff. Conflicted, Thor seeks consultation with Odin, who refuses his son's request to hook up with a mortal woman. Meanwhile, a newsflash comes from an island with a volcano on it that Loki and the amnesiac Thor made erupt from a few issues back. Somehow, a humanoid being made entirely out of pure lava has emerged and begun wreaking havoc. The Lava Man then begins making his way to New York City and have a confrontation with Thor. The Thunder God tries to fight him, however, the Lava Man can just melt into the sewers in order to escape.
I should point out that the Lava Man is a separate character from Mark Raxton, a.k.a. the Marvel antagonist, the Molten Man, who makes frequent appearances in the Spider-Man comics.
The Lava Man actually manages to trap Thor in some quick cooling magma and prepares to take out the United Nations. However, Thor manages to break free and uses a whirlwind to propel the Lava Man back from the volcano from whence he came. Unfortunately, this proves a hollow victory as Jane informs Dr. Blake that he's blown his shot and she's moving on to another office. A despondent Thor returns to Asgard, but Odin just tells him to get over it. Finally, Dr. Blake volunteers for an aid mission to India to get away from everything that reminds him of Jane. Upon arriving in India, Dr. Blake, and by extension Thor, learn of the tale of a researcher named Schechter and his assistant Klaus Voorhees. The two are working on a serum to treat venomous snake bites derived from cobra DNA. However, Klaus wanted all of the credit and thus by extension all of the money for himself. To that end, he staged an incident where it looked like a cobra had bitten both him and Professor Schechter. Voorhees then injected himself with the serum to try to cure the venomous snake bite. Funny thing though, it turns out that the cobra in question was radioactive, and this results in Voorhees' DNA being altered to take on the genetic traits of a cobra. This includes not only a venomous bite, but also the serpent's ability to slither up walls and its ultra-flexibility. A dying Professor Schechter informs Thor that Klaus Voorhees, now calling himself the Cobra, was last seen boarding a plane to New York City in order to mass-produce the Cobra serum. Thor has no choice but to rush back to New York City in order to stop Voorhees from creating an army of Cobra soldiers and thus forcing me to make another G.I. Joe reference. Thor manages to locate the Cobra at a chemical plant, however the confrontation is very short-lived as the Cobra uses a gas bomb to disorient Thor and temporarily make him drop Mjolnir, reverting him back to Donald Blake. And by the time Thor is completely recovered, the Cobra has slipped into the sewers for escape. It just so happens that Cobra winds up in the office of Dr. Andrews, who is Jane Foster's new employer. Andrews immediately chickens out and begins trying to aid the Cobra in creating his Cobra serum again. Realizing the horrible mistake she's made, Jane immediately tenders her resignation and alerts a passing Thor by throwing a test tube beaker through a window. Thor manages to rescue Jane Foster, who immediately goes back to working at Dr. Blake's office. However, the Cobra again manages to escape to terrorize people later.
The Cobra does become a recurring villain throughout the Marvel Universe, but he actually takes on Captain America a little bit more often, so you think of him as a Captain America foe. He even goes as far as to join two Serpent-themed supervillain teams, the Serpent Squad and the Serpent Society. He also becomes a frequent collaborator of the villain who pops up in our next story, Dr. Calvin Zabo, aka Mr. Hyde.
A group of onlookers witness Thor leaving for Asgard to once more get shot down in his quest to reveal his identity to Jane Foster. One of the onlookers then slinks away as feeling that it's time for Mr. Hyde to pay a visit to Dr. Donald Blake. Hyde arrives at Blake's office to get revenge for the Doctor turning down the real-life Calvin Zabo's job request, which in turn drove Zabo to create the Hyde serum. Thor returns to Earth with the news that Odin will only consider Jane Foster for immortality and thus being able to marry Thor if she truly proves herself worthy of the Thunder God's love. Of course, right when he returns is when Hyde comes smashing through the office door. Hyde grabs Blake and proceeds to throw him through an open window where it looks like he's fallen to his death. Of course, he avoids it by just barely transforming into Thor before hitting the ground. Hyde then steals some research papers as well as Jane Foster and heads off to a hidden location. However, when he hears news of Dr. Blake's survival, he is not very pleased and begins initiating a new plan. Things then take a bizarre turn as several witnesses describe seeing Thor rob several banks. Thor begins clashing with the authorities as he looks for Mr. Hyde, leaving him no other choice but to revert to Donald Blake so as not to attract attention. However, all that does is lead Hyde to Dr. Blake and capturing him to tie him up next to a bomb. Mr. Hyde then leaves with Jane Foster with the threat that if she ever rebels against him, he'll push the button to activate the bomb. Blake manages to reach his walking stick and transform into Thor as Hyde commandeers an escape submarine. The two fight both on and inside the submarine until Jane Foster, fearing for Donald Blake's life, interferes, allowing Hyde to escape. Unfortunately, Odin views this as Jane being unworthy of Thor's love. On the plus side, though, the authorities did find some evidence that showed that Hyde was actually cosplaying as Thor during the bank robberies, so they've cleared the Thunder God's name. Still, this provides a little comfort.
And that concludes at the Marvel Masterworks, The Mighty Thor Volume 1. How was it? Well, on the plus side, I do think there's actually some pretty solid characterization throughout all of this. I mean, it's not spectacular characterization, and, you know, if you're not up for cheesy melodrama, it can get a little grating, but for the most part, it sticks to it. The characters are well defined, and they don't really deviate too much throughout the whole thing. And, you know, to be honest, there's some good action-packed stories in this that are pretty decently paced. Unfortunately, if I do have a big criticism, it's probably that of the artwork. Now look, I am not trying to besmirch the good name of Jack Kirby here, okay? Jack Kirby was an immensely talented artist, and, you know, when he does work, it does work. Unfortunately, there's just kind of an inconsistency with this. One, Kirby did not draw all the artwork in this, and two, even when he does, he doesn't keep a consistent look through this. I mean, Odin has like 4 or 5 different appearances in this, and Jane Foster goes through like 5 billion hair colors. I mean, she changes hair colors mid-story sometimes. It just, again, like, come on, just a little bit of consistency there I don't think would have hurt. At least a little bit of recoloring wouldn't have hurt this. And also, this just kind of serves as a bit of a reminder of how much Thor's Rogues Gallery really sucks. You know, I mean, he's got Loki, and it's like, that's kind of it. I mean, especially early on here, like, the idea of seeing the Norse god of thunder taking down mob bosses and dictators and it's just, you know, a Chinese military and stuff like that, it's just like, wow, that just feels real off, you know? It just, you know, doesn't seem right. You know, you think Thor, you think of the grandiose fantasy adventure and the high epic stories. You don't think mob bosses and jewel thieves. He's not a street level hero, you know? And yeah, that kind of, again, leads to an overall inconsistent feeling in the book. Like I said, this isn't bad, and I guess if you are interested for the origins of the character, it's not the worst, but usually when people recommend Thor stories, they tend to recommend the ones from the late 70s and early 80s by a man named Walt Simonson, not necessarily these. So, overall, I'm going to give the Marvel Masterworks The Mighty Thor Volume 1 a C. And with that, let's see what we're doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Remember, you can help support my channel at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcatproductions. There, you can request a trade to be put in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box. Also, remember, like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.